The video Autogynephilia by ContraPoints. It's pure slander. It's simple. It's just slander. I know that it's pointless to respond to a 5-year, maybe 6-year at this point, old video. And that ContraPoints, he's never going to respond to me. Or should I say, she will never respond to me. But I've been vehemently upset by the mishandling of the subject matter. I recently read The Man Who Would Be Queen and Men Trapped in Men's Bodies because ContraPoint said they are edgy. In some sense, The Man Who Would Be Queen is edgy because it discusses politically incorrect things. It discusses male homosexuality and transsexuality in detail and has politically incorrect statements about both, even if it doesn't explicitly at all. It's pro homosexuality and pro transsexual. Men Trapped in Men's Bodies is even more so. It's a study of man to female transsexuals made up of self-reports by MTFs and their experiences, in their point of view often, their suffering of autogynephilia. So, first of all, let's get this out of the way. ContraPoints in that video is deliberately lying and using slander, and there's no way around it. It's so intense, you could take almost every single statement in that 48-minute video as a misrepresentation of the theory. ContraPoints is infamous for making bloated and self-indulgent content, and I don't want to make it worse by making a 4-hour video responding to everything that ContraPoints says throughout the video. And I'm going to be honest, I'm lazy, first of all. And second of all, I have a life. So, simply put it, as far as autogynephilia goes, ContraPoints never debunks it, and in some fact, seems to support its conclusion at every single turn. ContraPoints fundamentally agrees with the basic typology and just simply says they're mean words to describe reality, without ever tackling that reality. ContraPoints gives a short history of his decision in the video to transition and her own history of gender dysmorphia. Amusingly, it would be a very extreme case actually of autogynephilia, much more extreme than the vast majority, I should say, not all, but the majority of the cases within Men Trapped in Men's Bodies. His onset of dysmorphia is very late, and it begins with cross-dressing within an erotic situation. Most of the autogynephiles, they cross-dress early in their lives and then associate their sexual desire to it later as they grow up. Say it would be like a fetish implanted that as they go through puberty to discover that they would have had some kind of interest before they really masturbate or have sexual desires. It feels as such the ContraPoints is deliberately lying about the subject matter. So, let's just get beyond that, right? That's not very important for the whole thing. It's just what drove me to this topic in the first place. So let's talk about autogynephilia and how it's a theory. So, it's better known as Blanchard's transsexual typology. And that typology divides male to female transsexuals into two distinct categories, which do have bleed over, I should say. The so-called homosexual transsexuals and autogynephiles. The key distinction between the homosexual transsexual and the autogynephile is that the homosexual transsexual are attracted solely to men. The autogynephiles, on the other hand, are kind of everything else. They are men transitioning to women who are sexually attracted to women, are bisexual, or oftentimes even asexual. There is an overlapping set of characteristics that they both have, and each side, or each of these two typologies, might have different characteristics being more common within them. But the primary distinction between the two is their sexual attraction. It's important to note that both suffer from gender dysphoria. Homosexual transsexuals are essentially classical transsexuals. That's what traditionally in the West people would think of as transsexuals. And this is something that we really see in the wake of Christine Jorgensen in the 50s. Homosexual transsexuals are feminine men who are attracted to men who have lifelong desires to be women at a young age. They are essentially women born within men's bodies. The controversy from this whole setup comes from the very term autogynephile. That term, roughly translated, means sexually attracted to oneself as a woman. In essence, their gender dysphoria and their desire to transition stems from a misinformed sex drive. And within the typology, what creates this is what is called an erotic target location error, something which is believed to develop in the natural progression of sexual development of heterosexual men. This erotic desire latches itself onto something it associates with its target. You see, men are hardwired to be attracted to women's primary and secondary sexual features. So the target, the correct target, would be breasts, vagina, or the buttocks, right? Secondary sexual characteristics, the breasts, or the buttocks, or primary sexual characteristic, which I think is probably rarer, is direct attraction to the vagina. But oftentimes, men, heterosexual men that is, get off-target errors, right? They target the wrong thing, something that's not a secondary characteristic, or a mild secondary characteristic, or something that is only associated with women. And so a good example of this is a foot fetish. They are picking the wrong target, not these three primary things, right? Buttocks, breast, vagina, and maybe probably a fourth thing, right? Women's thighs, which are, compared to breasts and buttocks, significantly less important in the grand scheme of things, with the differences between men and women, but it's certainly more than a foot fetish, right? Feet have nothing to do with sexuality, but that's a very common paraphilia that develops from a target location error. Something else, because I was just talking about legs, that will develop is men becoming attracted to shaved legs or hairless women. This is very common, right? Women are now shaving their pubic hair in the West. Majority of millennial and Zoomer women probably do this now, and men are attracted to naked vaginas. That's in complete reversal of the natural order, right? But because men associate that with the female body, they become attracted to that target, and it's a target error. So likewise, let's back up. As such, a non-homosexual male to female transsexuality emerges from a targeting error. That's where, when looking at a woman as one subject of desire, the man targets himself, and this leads to his gender dysphoria. Essentially, he's attracted to women, but his own body becoming a woman. And this leads to gender dysphoria just as much and just as vibrantly and astutely as the homosexual transsexual's gender dysmorphia. But it is somewhat slower acting than the homosexual version. And that leads to autogynephils generally being much more latent in their transitions and coming out of the closet later in life compared. to their counterpart, the homosexual transsexual. Often, autogynephiles will try to fight back against their desire or attraction to becoming a woman. And they'll pursue a traditional romance with a woman. They will become married and sometimes have children. And so, as we're seeing transsexuality becoming a larger and larger and more out part of society, think about that. Think of how many men got married and had children and then get divorced and decide to become women. We have two very prominent examples, which is pretty, I think most people on the internet are going to be aware of, and to a certain extent the wider culture throughout the Anglosphere, right? Chris Tyson, very dear friend and close content creator of the massive YouTube channel, Mr. Beast, and Caitlyn Jenner. So, what is happening in these cases is that there's actually some kind of battle, and that autogynephilia is really a sexual preference, right? It is a sexual identity of its own, just as heterosexuality is. And this heterosexual male identity and this latent autogynephile identity are battling within these men. And sometimes the male heterosexual identity wins out, like a case like Ed Wood, right? And other times, like with a Chris Tyson, the primary sexuality that wins out is the autogynephile sexuality. And so a lot of times, because there's this ongoing battle between the identity of this person, when the autogynephile identifies himself as a transsexual, it will often be later in life, sometimes in middle age. One aspect of the autogynephile behavior is sexual attraction to one's body being feminized or presenting one's body as female. As such, they feel attraction to themselves as female. This attraction is similar in the way that heterosexual natal men are attracted to women. The entire theory will be strongman, though, into simply being that element in and of itself is alone. The term itself, autogynephile, seems to be the target of the criticism because the whole philia part of it casts the whole identity, the whole theory itself is demeaning to trans women. And I want to say, though, this behavior, though, is not exclusive to male to female transsexuals. Natal women and homosexual men are often aroused by their own bodies, or rather others' perception of their own bodies. Even ContraPoints within the video talks about men being proud of their own erections or the size of their penis. So that would be a similar self-centered sexual desire. Second of all, sexual attraction to one's own body, indeed becoming a woman or the thought of being a woman, does not exclude gender dysphoria. And you can't say that enough about this theory. Autogynephiles experience strong gender dysphoria, which is painful, psychologically and sometimes physically. Psychosomatically, physically. Indeed, the autogynephilia can make the gender dysphoria much worse. A lot of the subjects in men trapped in men's bodies testify that they're upset by this attraction themselves. And something like them feeling an erection while they're cross-dressing will be a source of great pain. It will set off gender dysmorphia, and it will cause the person to be very upset and will make them fall into depression because they feel that they cannot control their erection, something that, is pretty common to men, right? So competing theories of the development of male to female transsexuality are wanting in comparison to this typology. The essentialist natal femininity theory, or the idea that women are trapped in men's bodies, has several weaknesses. So how can one really know one is a woman if it's impossible for them ever to become a natal woman? And that's where the TERFs come in, right? The feminists that are very anti-trans and very exclusionary of them. Because our transsexuals, male to female transsexuals, really trying to be women because they want to be women, or are they trying to become a facsimile of women? Are they are they just are they truly being a woman? Are they experiencing womanhood? This is like a TERF thing, right? Or are they experiencing the facsimile of womanhood? Something they're attracted to, that facsimile. And then there's other problems. Why are lesbian or non-homosexual transsexuals so common? And now it seems like they're the majority over the classic type of homosexual transsexual. Why is gender dysmorphia so late and latent in so many cases? Why do a lot of these transsexuals have such unremarkable male childhoods? Why do so many transsexuals have very physical male brains, physically, I should say, male brains, and respond to sexual stimulation psychologically the same way that natal men do? The other theory being that gender is socially constructed, while there's a lot of cognitive dissonance that says otherwise, truly undermines transsexuality at a fundamental level. If gender is non-essentialist and is socially constructed, then there should be no point in transitioning. One should actually try to maybe like de-brainwash themselves, so to speak, until no longer believing in gender rather than transgendering or transitioning. And I think that what's really important to consider with Blanchard's typology is that it effectively includes transvestism within the whole framework, and so it's better as a whole. It explains much more, and it's much simpler. And so other theories artificially try to separate the two into two separate categories, but everybody knows that the two are connected. It's crushingly clear. To argue otherwise is reality denial. Under Blanchard's typology, erotic transvestism is also autogynephilic and falls under a spectrum of heterosexual attraction, which at the beginning stages, it's like, or parts of this are targeting women's clothing, and then targeting wearing women's clothing, and then becoming the target is one wants to become the woman. That's their attraction. So you have this spectrum that's going on there of this interconnectivity. It's a much broader, simpler, and more explanatory theory. So as such, while this is kind of demeaning, there's a lot of truth here. Those that have a much more mild version of autogynephilia will remain simply erotic transvestites and will never feel a full gender dysphoria and will ultimately never transition. And that's why that has remained through history such a common fetish. Keep in mind, within Blanchard's typology, right, autogynephilia is pretty common. There, like, a lot of men have this desire to view their body as a woman, or at some point are going to think about what they would do with themselves if they were a woman, or what they would do if they possessed a woman's body. It's a very common male fetish, and it fits along a spectrum with the end or the most extreme cases being autogynephilic male to female transitioners. If this explains so much, then why do transsexuals act so vehemently against it? Well, to start out with, natal women are naturally intimidated by male to female transitioners using their spaces. So if you are a transsexual woman that is, you could tell them that if you're not interested in them, that they should not be afraid of you. They should not be in danger because, after all, you are a woman trapped in a man's body. You're on part of a transition course. Ultimately, you will resemble them, and as this goes on, they need to be respectful of this. The ultimate course of your life and your transition, you will pass as one of them, right? And so your invasion of private spaces is not aggression. It is not the natural aggression of men inhibiting female spaces because ultimately you are a female. And so these traditional Kristen Jorgensen type trans women are usually depicted as being biological victims who are not interested in the women sexually and thus are not a threat to them. And the rejection and fear that women are going to feel towards them is only at the beginning of their transition. And the deeper they get through their transition and the more and more they their body reflects their internal disposition, the more they will pass and the less threatening they will be. And so they argue for tolerance, right? It's a good way to argue for tolerance. But if the man is attracted to you, he, even despite the transition, unlike a natal female lesbian, he could easily overpower and rape you. And women have a very hard time judging men to begin with. They have a hard time judging male threats. And so when you throw this in the line, it's very easy to see why women would fear this intrusion of their spaces. And that leads to them wanting to use this whole women trapped in a men's body stereotype. It deflects this natural fear of women and it pushes towards tolerance. And so going back, here's a secondary reason, is that transition clinics and hospitals that did sexual reassignment surgery would go out of their ways historically only to select the homosexual type, the traditional type of male to female transsexual for transition care. And they deliberately excluded all non-homosexual transsexuals under the explicit belief that they were harming them and that they were only pursuing medical intervention because of the influence of sexual desire rather than some kind of early and persistent femininity and gender dysphoria. They kind of the traditional point of view with these clinics is that the men who were attracted to women that were coming were basically just lying. And we know to a certain extent that has to be true because there's a lot of trans women that are older now that have said basically in retrospective that they lied about who they were attracted to. They lied about being the homosexual type on purpose because of this wall. And so it's kind of like a twofold thing. It's on both sides. This rejection of the autogynephile type was structural and it was fed into by the behavior of the autogynephiles itself. Thirdly, as I have said already, the language of autogynephilia, the very term just sounds offensive. While when it's explained in detail like I just did, it makes sense. Just the very title is demeaning, even if the explanation and what it means overall should not be demeaning, because again, it never precludes the experience of gender dysphoria. Because by saying it's a fetish, It connects it to other paraphilias. And you could see how somebody who feels they're going through a pretty traumatic psychological state, gender dysmorphia, would be pretty upset if you called them a pervert, right? A fetishist. But overall, I think that this whole thing is moot. It doesn't matter anymore because we have this shift of abundance of easily accessible transition care. And now we have informed consent, which means there's this greatly diminished pressure to prevent yourself as the wrong sex trapped in the wrong body. And so you really don't need to say that you don't have desires towards the opposite sex, that you were born from your natal sex. That's kind of pointless now, because the reality is, if you spent literally all day jerking off on Fiction Mania, and you want to literally follow through those fantasies, I don't think you're going to get any pushback with informed consent. The whole physical angle of transition, too, is succumbing to a broader acceptance of body modification and just kind of a rise of post-human ideals throughout society. Just look at how common tattooing is becoming. Look how common piercing is becoming. Look how common stuff like gauges in your ears and just elective plastic surgery in general is. And so I think the more and more common body modification is, the transsexuality in some sense falls under the umbrella of body modification just as much as it falls under the LGBTQ umbrella. And so the perception of a lot of people going forward is that technology, in the way that it's increasing, is going to allow people to modify themselves more and more, and the transsexuality ultimately is just becoming one more modification amongst many.